The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune above the factory floor of Meridian Manufacturing in Detroit, Michigan, casting harsh shadows across faces I'd known for nearly 2 decades. The morning air still carried the metallic scent of precision work, a smell that had become as comforting to me as my morning coffee. "We're implementing a comprehensive digital transformation initiative," announced Rebecca Morrison, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of machinery like a blade through silk. Her eyes swept across the assembled workforce with practiced indifference, never quite landing on mine. "This modernization will require some organizational restructuring. My name is Marcus Chun, and for 18 years, I had been the heartbeat of this place. 18 years of breathing life into aging machines, of writing code that turned obsolete equipment into precision instruments, of solving problems that existed only in the space between what was supposed to work and what actually did." I stood among my colleagues. No, former colleagues, watching Rebecca's lips move as she delivered what I already knew was my professional death sentence. The words seemed to float in the air like dust motes in sunlight. Redundancies, optimization, third-party solutions. Corporate euphemisms for a simple truth. Marcus Chun was no longer needed. The irony wasn't lost on me. Behind Rebecca, the very machines I had nursed back to health countless times continued their rhythmic dance of creation. The CNC lathe in Bay 2 that I'd kept running 5 years past its expected lifespan. The quality control system I'd built from scratch when a manufacturer went bankrupt. The conveyor network that moved like clockwork because I'd taught it to think. Effective immediately, we'll be partnering with TechFlow Solutions for our systems management and automation needs. Rebecca continued, her MBA-polished delivery betraying no hint of the chaos she was about to unleash. "This transition represents our commitment to industry-leading technology and operational excellence." I felt the weight of 37 pairs of eyes on me. Some curious, others sympathetic, most simply relieved it wasn't them. Marcus had always been untouchable, they'd thought. Marcus knew things nobody else could figure out. Marcus fixed what couldn't be fixed. But untouchable, I was learning, was just another word for expendable when the numbers on a spreadsheet demanded it. I didn't rage or argue or make a scene. Men who fight the inevitable in public die twice. Once when they're defeated, and again when their dignity abandons them. Instead, I nodded once, a gesture so subtle it might have been mistaken for a muscle twitch, and walked back to my workstation with the measured gait of a man who'd seen this coming from miles away. My desk, soon to be someone else's desk, contained the archaeology of a career. The coffee mug my son Danny had made in art class when he was 8, now 15 and more interested in video games than his old man's work. My reading glasses, the backup pair I kept for late nights when the primary broke and the spare was at home. A notebook filled with handwritten code sequences, calibration notes, and the kind of tribal knowledge that lived in the spaces between official documentation. As I packed these remnants into a cardboard box that smelled faintly of printer paper and broken dreams, I let my mind wander back to the beginning. Harold Meridian had hired me fresh out of Wayne State University's engineering program 20 years ago. I was 24, cocky with the confidence that only comes from never having failed at anything that mattered. Harold was 63, gray-bearded and grease-stained, a man who'd built his company with his own hands and understood that machines, like people, had personalities. "Son," he'd said on my first day, leading me past rows of equipment that hummed and sparked and moved with purpose. "These machines don't just follow orders. They have moods, preferences, little quirks you learn to work with instead of against. The engineers who designed them, they're long gone. The manuals they wrote, they're based on perfect conditions that don't exist in the real world. What keeps this place running isn't documentation. It's understanding." He'd been right, of course. Over the years, I'd become something more than an automation engineer. I was a translator, fluent in the language these machines spoke, in vibrations and temperature fluctuations and the subtle changes in the pitch of their mechanical voices. When a Model 7 stamping press started throwing error codes that didn't exist in any manual, I'd learned to listen to the rhythm of its hydraulics. When the quality control sensors began giving false positives, I'd taught them to see the difference between real defects and shadows cast by wear patterns in the lighting. I'd built systems within systems, layers of code and calibration that turned Meridian manufacturing into something approaching magic. We took raw materials and transformed them into components so precise that NASA had become one of our regular customers. Defense contractors trusted us with parts that would eventually find their way into fighter jets and submarines. The automotive industry relied on us for tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. But apparently, none of that mattered anymore. Rebecca had arrived 8 months ago with credentials that looked impressive on paper. MBA from Northwestern, previous experience optimizing operational efficiency at 3 manufacturing companies in the Midwest. She spoke fluent corporate, the kind of English that turned people into human capital and problems into challenges and failures into learning opportunities. What she didn't speak was machine. In our first meeting, she'd spread out diagrams and flowcharts across the conference table like tarot cards, each one promising to divine the future of our operations. Your system's architecture is fascinating, Marcus, she'd said, tracing her finger along lines that connected equipment manufactured in different decades. But it's also incredibly vulnerable. What happens if something happens to you? It was a fair question wrapped in a threat. What would happen to Meridian if I got hit by a bus, had a heart attack, decided to retire? The honest answer was that the factory would continue running for maybe 3 weeks before the first critical failure brought everything to a halt. The systems I'd built were like a symphony written for an orchestra of one. They worked perfectly, but only if you understood the music. I've been thinking about documentation, I'd replied. Training programs, knowledge transfer protocols. Give me 6 months, and I can teach your people everything they need to know. Rebecca had smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. That's exactly the kind of forward thinking we need. But I'm wondering if there might be a more scalable solution. She'd already made up her mind, I realized later. The meeting wasn't about finding solutions. It was about building justification for a decision that had been made in some corporate boardroom, probably with my salary circled in red on a spreadsheet. Rebecca needed to modernize something to prove her worth to the executives who'd hired her, and I was the biggest line item that could be eliminated without immediately shutting down production. The cruel irony was that she was absolutely right about the vulnerability. I had made myself indispensable, but I'd also made myself irreplaceable in a way that made me expensive and dangerous. Every company wants institutional knowledge right up until they have to pay for it. 3 months before my termination, I'd started noticing the signs. Consultants from TechFlow Solutions walked the factory floor with tablets and clipboards, photographing control panels and interviewing operators about their daily routines. They measured and documented and asked the kinds of questions that people ask when they're planning to change everything. I'd approached Rebecca about it. Are we implementing new systems? Just exploring some optimization opportunities, she'd replied, not looking up from her laptop. Nothing to worry about. But I was worried, and with good reason. 2 weeks later, I tried to access the main management server to update some calibration files and found my credentials had expired. IT claimed it was a glitch, but when they restored my access, half my administrative privileges were gone. Functions I'd been performing for years now required approval from Rebecca's office. I mentioned it to Tommy Rodriguez, our floor supervisor and the closest thing I had a friend at work. Tommy had been with Meridian almost as long as I had, working his way up from line operator to his current position through a combination of hard work and street smarts that no MBA program could teach. Politics, Tommy had muttered, not looking up from the production report he was reviewing. New boss needs to make her mark. Just keep your head down and do your job. That night, I'd gone home to my empty house. Sarah had taken Danny and moved to Phoenix after our divorce 2 years earlier, and made copies of everything. Every calibration file, every piece of custom code, every troubleshooting manual I'd written but never formally documented. Not company property, I told myself. My intellectual work, developed on my own time, refined through experience that belonged to me alone. I backed it all up to encrypted drives and cloud storage, not out of malice, but out of instinct. A lifetime of fixing other people's problems had taught me to always have a plan B. I should have seen what was coming. The signs were all there. The consultants, the locked credentials, the way Rebecca had started talking around me instead of to me in meetings. But there's a particular kind of blindness that comes from believing you're too valuable to lose. I'd fixed every crisis, solved every problem, kept production running through equipment failures and natural disasters and supply chain disruptions. I was Marcus Chun. I kept the lights on, right up until the moment they switched them off. The meeting with Human Resources lasted 23 minutes. Jennifer Walsh, the HR director who'd started 2 weeks after I did nearly 20 years ago, couldn't meet my eyes as she slid the severance package across the conference table. 2 months' pay plus your accrued vacation time, she said, her voice carefully neutral. And your health insurance will continue for 90 days. I flipped through the pages without reading them. The numbers were probably fair by corporate standards, generous, even considering they didn't have to give me anything beyond what was legally required. But fairness had nothing to do with how I felt sitting in that sterile conference room, signing papers that officially ended nearly 2 decades of my life. Is there anything else you need from me? I asked when the paperwork was complete. Jennifer hesitated. Actually, Rebecca mentioned that you might be willing to consider a short-term consulting arrangement. 2 weeks to help with the transition. It would provide you with some additional income while you're job searching. I almost laughed. 2 weeks to download 20 years of institutional knowledge. 2 weeks to explain systems that had taken me years to develop and refine. 2 weeks to train someone else to do what I'd spent most of my adult life learning how to do. That's generous, I said, standing up. But I'll pass. The walk through the factory floor to the exit was its own kind of torture. Past the machines I'd programmed and reprogrammed, past the control systems that bore my digital fingerprints, past the workstations where I'd spent countless hours solving problems that existed nowhere in any manual. Tommy caught up with me near the exit. "This is bullshit, Marcus," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "Rebecca doesn't know what she's doing. You're the only one who really understands how everything works together." Apparently, TechFlow Solutions disagrees. "They're consultants," Tommy said with disgust. "They don't know what they don't know." I stopped walking and looked at him. Tommy was a good man, loyal and hardworking, but he was also practical. He had a mortgage and 2 kids in college and couldn't afford to make enemies of the new management. "What exactly do you want me to do, Tommy? Beg for my job back? Tell Rebecca she's making a mistake?" He had no answer for that. "I'll call you," I lied. "Maybe we can grab a beer sometime." But I wouldn't call, and I think Tommy knew it. Some bridges burned completely, leaving nothing but empty space where connection used to be. The drive home took 22 minutes, the same route I'd traveled twice a day for nearly 2 decades. Past the Coney Dog place where I'd grabbed lunch 1,000 times. Past the gas station where I'd filled up every Tuesday. Past the hardware store where I'd bought tools and supplies for weekend projects that would never happen now. My house felt different when I walked through the front door, smaller somehow, as if losing my job had also robbed it of its purpose. The mortgage that had seemed manageable with a steady paycheck now loomed like a storm cloud. The retirement account that had been growing steadily for 20 years suddenly seemed inadequate for whatever came next. I sat in my home office chair and opened my laptop. A notification appeared immediately. Meridian Manufacturing VPN. Connection terminated. Even my digital connection to the place had been severed with bureaucratic efficiency. That's when it hit me, really hit me, what had just happened. 20 years of getting up before dawn to handle emergencies. 20 years of staying late to complete upgrades while the production lines were down. 20 years of taking calls at home, on weekends, during family vacations, whenever something broke that only I knew how to fix. All of it had just been declared worthless by a woman who'd been on the job for 8 months. I opened my personal drive and looked at the files I'd backed up. Calibration parameters that had taken years to perfect. Custom firmware that I'd written to squeeze performance out of machines that should have been replaced a decade ago. Troubleshooting guides that existed nowhere in any official documentation because the problems they solved weren't supposed to be possible. I had no intention of using them against Meridian Manufacturing, but I also had no intention of handing them over for free. They made their choice. Rebecca had decided that 20 years of my knowledge could be replaced by a consulting contract and some shiny new software. They were about to learn whether she was right. 6 weeks passed before the phone rang. I'd spent the time productively, updating my resume, taking calls from recruiters, fishing the Detroit River when the spring weather turned warm enough. The severance checks arrived on schedule, and I'd managed to land a few interviews with companies that were impressed by my background but concerned about the gap in employment. "Why did you leave Meridian?" was always the first question, and I'd learned to give an honest answer that didn't sound bitter. They decided to modernize their systems architecture and brought in outside consultants to handle the implementation. What I didn't say was that I knew exactly what was happening at my former workplace. I still had friends in the industry, and Detroit's manufacturing community was smaller than people realized. Word traveled fast when a company started having quality control problems, when delivery schedules began slipping, when customers started complaining about defects that had never been issues before. So I wasn't entirely surprised when my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number on a Thursday afternoon in early May. "Marcus, this is Rebecca Morrison from Meridian Manufacturing." I let the silence stretch for a beat longer than was comfortable. "Hello, Rebecca. I hope you're doing well." Her voice had lost some of its corporate confidence. There was something underneath now. Not quite desperation, but definitely urgency. "I'm doing fine, thanks. What can I do for you?" "We're experiencing some technical difficulties with our precision machining line, and our team is having trouble diagnosing the issue. I was wondering if you might be available for a brief consultation." I closed my eyes and smiled. The precision machining line, the crown jewel of our aerospace contracts, the system that produced parts for satellite components and military applications. The system that required calibration so precise that a temperature change of 3 degrees could throw tolerances out of specification. The system I've been warning maintenance about for months before my departure. "What kind of difficulties?" I asked. "Random tolerance failures, parts that test fine on the floor but fail final inspection. We've had to scrap nearly 30% of our aerospace production this week." 30%. I whistled low. "That's expensive." "Yes, it is." Rebecca's voice was tight. "Our customer is threatening to pull the contract if we can't resolve this quickly." "And what does TechFlow Solutions say about the problem?" A pause. "They're still analyzing the situation." Translation. They had no idea what was wrong, but they weren't ready to admit it yet. "I see," I said. "Well, I'm available for consulting work. My rate is $400 per hour, 8-hour minimum, paid in advance, and I'll need a written contract specifying the exact scope of work." 400. Rebecca's voice trailed off. "That's nearly 3 times your former salary rate." "That's my consulting rate," I said evenly. "I'm no longer an employee, Rebecca. I'm a business owner now. Take it or leave it." The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. I could practically hear her calculating the cost of my consulting fee against the cost of losing the aerospace contract. "I'll have to get approval," she said finally. "Of course. Let me know what you decide." She called back within 2 hours. They'd agreed to my terms. Meridian Manufacturing looked exactly the same from the outside. The same faded brick walls, the same parking lot filled with pickup trucks and aging sedans, the same security guard who'd waved at me every morning for 15 years. But everything felt different as I signed in as a visitor and clipped a temporary badge to my shirt. Rebecca met me at the security desk, looking harried in a way that expensive business suits couldn't quite conceal. "Thank you for coming, Marcus. I really appreciate this." I nodded and followed her through familiar hallways toward the production floor. The sound hit me first, the symphony of machinery that had been the soundtrack to my adult life. But something was off. The rhythm was wrong, stuttered and uncertain where it should have been smooth and confident. "How long has the line been running at reduced capacity?" I asked. 3 weeks, Rebecca admitted. "We've been trying to maintain delivery schedules by running overtime on the other lines, but that was unsustainable, and we both knew it. Overtime pay, equipment wear, employee fatigue. All of it added up to costs that would make the company's quarterly numbers look ugly." The precision machining line sat partially idle, surrounded by frustrated operators and 2 men in polo shirts who could only be TechFlow consultants. I recognized the look on their faces, the particular blend of confusion and stubborn determination that came from encountering a problem that wasn't supposed to exist. Tommy spotted me from across the floor and broke into the first genuine smile I'd seen since walking through the door. "Marcus, thank God you're here. This thing has been driving us crazy." I spent the first hour just observing, watching the machines cycle through their operations, listening to the subtle variations in sound that most people would never notice. The problem wasn't immediately obvious. It never was with the complex systems, but I could feel it like a discordant note in an otherwise perfect chord. "When did you first notice the tolerance issues?" I asked Tommy. "About a month ago. Started small, just a few parts here and there, but it's been getting worse every week." A month ago, right around the time TechFlow would have started implementing their optimization protocols, I connected my laptop to the line's control system and began pulling diagnostic data. What I saw made me shake my head in a mixture of amazement and disgust. Someone had optimized the calibration parameters, adjusting settings that I'd spent years perfecting in pursuit of marginal efficiency gains. "Who authorized changes to the master calibration files?" I asked. Rebecca looked uncomfortable. TechFlow identified some optimization opportunities. Minor adjustments to improve throughput. Minor adjustments. I wanted to laugh, but the situation was too serious for humor. They'd taken a precision instrument and tried to make it run faster by loosening the very tolerances that made precision possible. The fix would require reverting to my original calibration settings, but those existed only in my personal backups. Even if I restored them, the system would need time to stabilize, and every part produced during that period would need individual inspection. "I can fix this," I told Rebecca, "but it's going to take most of the day, and you'll need to halt production on this line until tomorrow morning." Her face went pale. "We have a shipment due Friday. Then you should have called me 3 weeks ago." It took me 7 hours to repair what TechFlow had broken in their quest for optimization. 7 hours of methodically restoring calibration parameters, updating firmware, and running test cycles until the machines sang in harmony again. As I worked, I couldn't help but overhear the TechFlow consultants trying to explain to Rebecca what had gone wrong. Their technical jargon was impressive: machine learning algorithms, predictive analytics, cloud-based optimization protocols. But it was clear they didn't understand the fundamental principle underlying the system I'd built. Manufacturing isn't just about efficiency. It's about consistency, reliability, and the kind of precision that comes from understanding that every machine has its own personality. You can't optimize what you don't understand, and you can't understand what you haven't lived with for years. By 6 o'clock, the line was running perfectly again. Parts were testing within specification, and the operators were smiling for the first time in weeks. Rebecca watched from the observation deck as I packed up my equipment, her expression unreadable. "Marcus," she said as I prepared to leave, "I want you to know how much I appreciate this. We were really in a bind." I nodded, happy to help. "Actually," she hesitated, "we've been having similar issues with some of our other systems. The automotive line has been showing intermittent problems, and the quality control system has been flagging defects that aren't actually there. Would you be willing to take a look while you're here?" I checked my watch. That would exceed our agreed scope of work. You'd need to set up separate consulting contracts for each system. Her face tightened. "Marcus, be reasonable. You're already here, and these problems are all related to what you fixed today." "I'm being reasonable," I replied evenly. "I'm treating this as the business relationship you created when you eliminated my position. If you want additional consulting work, we need additional contracts." As I walked toward the exit, Tommy fell in a step beside me. "It's not just those systems," he said quietly. "Everything's starting to fall apart. Yesterday, the conveyor system shut down for 2 hours because of an error code that isn't in any manual. Quality control has been catching defects that I haven't seen in years. Return rates from customers are up 40%. I kept walking, but I was listening. They're in over their heads, aren't they?" Tommy asked. "Looks that way. You saw this coming, didn't you?" I stopped at the exit and looked at him. Tommy had worked alongside me for 15 years. He'd seen me build systems from nothing, watch me solve problems that had stumped engineers with decades more experience than me. He knew me well enough to recognize that I never left anything to chance. I didn't have to see it coming, Tommy. I built these systems. I know exactly what happens when they're not maintained properly, and you gotta make them pay for it. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. They're already paying for it. I'm just sending them the bill. The calls became weekly, then twice weekly, then almost daily. Each time Rebecca reached out with another emergency, another system failure that TechFlow couldn't diagnose or fix. Each time I negotiated a new contract, raised my rates slightly, and solved only the specific problem they'd hired me to address. $5,000 to restore the automotive line's precision. $7,000 to reprogram the quality control system that had been corrupted by optimization updates. $3,000 to fix a conveyor malfunction that brought the entire factory to a halt for 6 hours. Each repair revealed more evidence of TechFlow's incompetence and Rebecca's desperation to justify her decision. They tried to reverse engineer systems that had taken me years to develop, breaking crucial connections in the process. Their machine learning algorithms had learned from corrupted data, perpetuating errors instead of correcting them. Their cloud-based monitoring system had introduced security vulnerabilities that could have given hackers access to our manufacturing processes. But the most damaging discovery came during my 4th consulting visit, when I accessed the management server to repair a scheduling system malfunction. There, in a folder marked Strategic Initiatives, I found Rebecca's original proposal to the corporate executives who'd hired her. The document was titled Operational Optimization Through Legacy System Modernization, and it laid out her plan in corporate language that barely concealed its ruthlessness. Eliminating my position would save the company $180,000 annually. Contracting with TechFlow for systems management would cost $120,000 per year. Net savings, $60,000, plus the elimination of single point of failure risk associated with employee-dependent systems. The proposal projected a temporary increase in defect rates during the transition period, up to 5%, which was deemed acceptable within industry standards. It anticipated some customer complaints and warranty claims, but calculated that the cost savings would more than offset these temporary expenses. Rebecca hadn't just eliminated my position to modernize operations. She'd gambled with 20 years of quality reputation to save $60,000 and make herself look good to corporate executives who understood spreadsheets better than they understood manufacturing. She'd never bothered to ask what those systems actually did or why they worked the way they did. She'd never questioned why Meridian had the lowest defect rate in the industry despite running equipment that was older than some of her employees. She'd seen complexity and assumed inefficiency, mistaken craftsmanship for obsolescence. Now she was learning the true cost of her assumptions. 2 months after my termination, I received a call that wasn't from Rebecca. The voice on the other end was deeper, more authoritative, and carried the kind of confidence that comes from making decisions that affect thousands of people. Mr. Chun, this is David Castellanos, Vice President of Operations for Drake Industries. I sat up straighter in my chair. Drake Industries owned Meridian Manufacturing along with 5 other manufacturing facilities across the Midwest. David Castellanos was the kind of executive who appeared in trade magazines and spoke at industry conferences about the future of American manufacturing. Good afternoon, Mr. Castellanos. I'll get straight to the point. Marcus. May I call you Marcus? Our Detroit facility is experiencing unprecedented quality control issues. Customer complaint rates have increased by 60% over the past 2 months. We've lost 2 major contracts due to delivery delays and quality concerns. I understand you've been providing consulting services to address some of these technical problems. That's correct, I said carefully. I'd like to discuss a more comprehensive arrangement. Are you available to me in person? 2 days later, I found myself in the executive conference room at Meridian Manufacturing, sitting across from David Castellanos and 2 other executives I didn't recognize. Rebecca was notably absent from the meeting. Castellanos was younger than I'd expected, probably mid-40s, with the kind of focused intensity that successful executives develop as a survival mechanism. He got right to business. Marcus, I'm going to be direct with you. The implementation of new systems at this facility has not gone according to plan. Our consulting partner has been unable to resolve the technical issues we're experiencing, and each week of continued problems costs us approximately $80,000 in lost production, overtime, and quality claims. I remain silent, waiting. I've reviewed your consulting contracts and spoken with production staff about the work you've done over the past 2 months. It's clear that you have institutional knowledge that we need. I'd like to offer you a 6-month contract to resolve our current crisis and implement proper knowledge transfer protocols to prevent this situation from recurring. What happened to Tech Flow Solutions? I asked. We're terminating that relationship, Castellanos said bluntly. They oversold their capabilities and underdelivered on their promises. More importantly, they failed to understand the complexity of the systems they were trying to replace. I leaned back in my chair, considering. What kind of arrangement are you proposing? Full-time contract position for 6 months. Complete authority over systems management and technical operations. Your job would be to fix what's broken and ensure it stays fixed after you're gone. And compensation? Name your price. The phrase hung in the air like an invitation to redemption. 6 months at 3 times my former salary would set me up financially while I decided what to do next. It would also give me the opportunity to restore the systems I'd spent 20 years building and maybe, just maybe, ensure that no other engineer would go through what I'd experienced. $250,000 for 6 months, I said, plus benefits, plus a guaranteed consulting contract for 2 years after the project is complete. Castellanos didn't hesitate. Done. As we shook hands, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. The satisfaction of being valued for what I could do instead of punished for what I cost. Walking back into Meridian Manufacturing as a contractor felt different from my previous consulting visits. This time, I wasn't there to put Band-Aids on bleeding systems. I was there to perform surgery, to cut out the infections and restore healthy function to the complex organism I'd helped create over 2 decades. My first stop was Rebecca's office, but I found it empty. Her nameplate was gone from the door, and the space had been cleared of personal belongings. She was reassigned last week, explained Janet Martinez, the new interim plant manager who'd been brought in from Drake Industries' Chicago facility. After the scope of the problems here became clear, corporate decided a change in leadership was necessary. I felt a momentary pang of something that might have been sympathy, but it passed quickly. Rebecca had made choices based on her own ambitions and career goals. Now she was living with the consequences, just as I'd had to live with mine. My first week back was spent in archaeology, carefully excavating the layers of changes that TechFlow had implemented over the past 4 months. What I found was worse than I'd expected. They hadn't just optimized existing systems. They'd tried to replace my custom solutions with off-the-shelf software that was never designed for our specific applications. The precision machining line had been connected to a generic monitoring system that treated all equipment identically, ignoring the subtle differences between machines that I'd spent years learning to accommodate. The quality control system had been upgraded with artificial intelligence that had learned to identify defects from a corrupted training dataset, flagging good parts as defective while missing actual problems. Most damaging of all, they'd attempted to centralize control systems that I'd deliberately kept separate for redundancy and security reasons. A single software failure could now bring down multiple production lines simultaneously, exactly the kind of vulnerability that I'd designed the original architecture to prevent. Fixing it would require more than just restoring my backup files. I need to rebuild entire subsystems from scratch, test every connection, and recalibrate machines that have been running out of specification for months. But I also saw an opportunity. As I worked to restore Meridian's manufacturing systems, I began designing something new, a comprehensive management platform that would integrate all the factory's equipment while maintaining the redundancy and flexibility that made my original systems so reliable. I called it Meridian OS, and it represented everything I'd learned over 20 years of industrial automation. Unlike TechFlow's generic solutions, Meridian OS was built specifically for our equipment, our processes, our needs. It included automated diagnostics that could predict maintenance requirements weeks in advance, quality control algorithms that learned from actual production data instead of theoretical models, and security protocols that protected critical systems from both external attacks and internal misconfigurations. Most importantly, Meridian OS included comprehensive documentation and training modules designed to ensure that the knowledge I'd accumulated over 2 decades could be transferred to other engineers instead of walking out the door with me when I retired. 3 months into my contract, I presented the system to David Castellanos and his executive team. This isn't just about fixing our current problems, I explained, standing before the conference room screen that displayed real-time production data from across the factory. It's about creating a sustainable foundation for the future. Meridian OS eliminates the single point of failure risk that made my original systems vulnerable, while preserving the precision and reliability that made them effective. Castellanos leaned forward, studying the dashboard that showed every machine, every process, every quality metric in perfect synchronization. How long would full implementation take? We're already running on Meridian OS, I said with a slight smile. Everything you're seeing, the production metrics, the quality data, the maintenance schedules, it's all running on the new platform. I've been implementing it piece by piece over the past month, testing each component before bringing it online. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. While they've been expecting me to repair their broken systems, I've been building something entirely new. And who would maintain this system going forward? Asked one of the other executives. That's where the knowledge transfer component comes in, I said, clicking to the next slide. Meridian OS includes comprehensive training modules, automated troubleshooting guides, and built-in documentation for every function. More importantly, I'm prepared to train a team of engineers to maintain and upgrade the system independently. At what cost? Castellanos asked. This was the moment I'd been building toward. I'd like to propose forming Chun Engineering Solutions as a subsidiary of Drake Industries. My company would maintain licensing agreements for Meridian OS across all Drake facilities, provide ongoing support and upgrades, and serve as a consulting resource for other manufacturers facing similar challenges. I clicked to a financial projection showing the costs of my proposal compared to the losses they'd experienced over the past 6 months. The numbers spoke for themselves. You're proposing to turn your consulting work into a permanent business relationship, Castellanos observed. I'm proposing to turn a crisis into a competitive advantage, I corrected. Drake Industries would own a manufacturing management system that no competitor could replicate, supported by engineers who understand both the technology and the industry. 6 months later, I stood in the executive office of Chun Engineering Solutions, located in a refurbished warehouse 3 miles from Meridian Manufacturing. Through the large windows, I could see the Detroit River flowing past, carrying barges loaded with raw materials that would be transformed into precision components at factories across the region. The space housed 22 employees now, software engineers, manufacturing specialists, and project managers who helped implement Meridian OS installations at Drake Industries facilities and other manufacturers who'd heard about our success. My phone buzzed with a text from Tommy Rodriguez, who'd accepted my offer to become Director of Field Operations for Chun Engineering. Phoenix facility installation complete. All systems green. Customer wants to discuss expansion to their Texas plant. I smiled, remembering the day I'd offered Tommy the position. He'd been skeptical at first. Leaving a secure job at Meridian to join a startup took courage, especially for a man with a family to support. But he'd seen what I was building, understood the potential, and made the leap. Now, he was earning twice what he'd made as a floor supervisor, traveling the country to implement systems that were revolutionizing manufacturing operations. The industry had started to take notice. Manufacturing Today had featured Chun Engineering Solutions on their cover 3 months ago with the headline, The Knowledge Revolution: How One Engineer Turned Termination into Transformation. The article detailed our work at 6 different facilities, showcasing defect rate improvements averaging 43% and efficiency gains that had saved our clients millions of dollars. More importantly, we'd proven that institutional knowledge didn't have to die with the people who possessed it. Meridian OS had been installed at 12 facilities across 7 states. each implementation creating a repository of manufacturing wisdom that could be shared, taught, and improved upon by future generations of engineers. On a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after my termination from Meridian Manufacturing, I received an unexpected visitor at my office. My assistant knocked on my door and announced, "Mr. Chun, there's a Rebecca Morrison here to see you. She says it's personal." I almost told her to send Rebecca away. The woman who destroyed my career and nearly bankrupted a company through her arrogance and incompetence had no place in my new life. But curiosity won out over resentment. "Send her in." Rebecca entered my office looking smaller than I remembered, wearing a simple business suit instead of the designer clothes she'd favored at Meridian. Her confident corporate demeanor had been replaced by something that looked like humility or maybe just exhaustion. "Hello, Marcus. Thank you for seeing me." I gestured to the chair across from my desk, but didn't offer pleasantries. "What can I do for you, Rebecca?" She sat down carefully, as if afraid the chair might collapse beneath her. "I wanted to apologize, and to explain." "Explain what?" "Why I did what I did. Why I made the decisions that led to everything that happened." I leaned back in my chair, studying her face. The Rebecca Morrison who'd announced my termination with corporate efficiency was gone. In her place sat a woman who looked like she'd spent sleepless nights confronting the consequences of her choices. "I'm listening." She took a deep breath. "When Drake Industries hired me to manage Meridian, I was given very specific instructions. Cut costs by 15% within the first year. Modernize operations to align with corporate standards. Show measurable improvement in efficiency metrics." "So you decided I was too expensive." "It wasn't personal, Marcus. I looked at the payroll data, saw that you were making more than anyone else in the facility, and assumed that meant you were overpaid. I saw systems that looked outdated and assumed they were inefficient. I made assumptions based on spreadsheets instead of understanding." I said nothing, waiting for her to continue. TechFlow's presentation was very convincing. They showed me examples of their work at other facilities, cost savings, efficiency improvements, modernization success stories. They made it sound like your systems were holding us back instead of holding us together. And the kickbacks. Rebecca's face flushed. I was young and stupid and thought I was smarter than everyone around me. TechFlow offered me a consulting fee for helping them secure the contract. I convinced myself it was just business, that I was being compensated for my expertise in evaluating their proposal. "You were being bribed to fire me and hire them." "Yes." The word came out as barely a whisper. And when everything started falling apart, when the defect rates started climbing and customers started complaining, I was too proud to admit I'd made a mistake. I kept thinking TechFlow would figure it out, that the problems were temporary, that I could manage the situation until things stabilized. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the river while I processed what she told me. The Rebecca Morrison who destroyed my career had been driven by ambition and greed, but she'd also been manipulated by consultants who'd made promises they couldn't keep and pressured by executives who'd prioritized short-term savings over long-term stability. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it made her human in a way that pure malice wouldn't have. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked without turning around. "Because I've spent the last 6 months working at a facility in Ohio where they're facing the same problems we had at Meridian. Old equipment, complex systems, an engineer who's been there for 20 years and understands how everything works. And management is starting to make the same noises about modernization and cost-cutting." I turned to face her, and I tried to warn them. I told them about what happened at Meridian, about the costs of losing institutional knowledge, about the importance of understanding systems before trying to change them. They've labeled me the troublemaker and are starting to talk about finding someone with a more progressive outlook. "So you're going to get fired for trying to prevent someone else from making your mistakes?" "Probably." Rebecca laughed, but there was no humor in it. The irony isn't lost on me. We sat in silence for several minutes. Two people who'd been on opposite sides of a corporate tragedy that had destroyed one career and launched another. "What do you want from me, Rebecca?" "I don't want anything," she said. "I just wanted you to know that I understand what I did to you and that I'm sorry. You didn't deserve what happened, and I was wrong to prioritize my career over your life's work. I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation, but found only regret and something that might have been wisdom earned through failure. Apology accepted, I said finally. Rebecca stood up to leave, then hesitated at the door. For what it's worth, what you've built here is remarkable. The industry is talking about Chun Engineering Solutions as the future of manufacturing consulting. You turned something terrible into something extraordinary. After she left, I sat alone in my office thinking about forgiveness and revenge and the strange ways that life sometimes offers both simultaneously. Rebecca Morrison had destroyed my career at Meridian Manufacturing, but in doing so, she'd forced me to discover capabilities I'd never known I possessed. Her betrayal had been the catalyst for a transformation that had made me wealthier, more successful, and more fulfilled than I'd ever been as an employee. Sometimes the best revenge isn't inflicting punishment on those who wrong you. Sometimes it's becoming something they never imagined you could be. 3 months after Rebecca's visit, I received a call that brought my story full circle in the most unexpected way. Mr. Chun, this is Harold Meridian. I nearly dropped the phone. Harold Meridian, the founder of the company where I'd spent 20 years of my life. The man who'd hired me fresh out of college and taught me that machines had personalities. Mr. Meridian, it's been a long time. Too long, son. I understand congratulations are in order. I've been reading about Chin Engineering Solutions in the trade magazines. Sounds like you've built something impressive. Thank you, sir. I learned from the best. Harold chuckled. Flattery will get you everywhere, Marcus. But I'm not calling just to congratulate you. I have a proposition. I leaned back in my chair, intrigued. I'm sure you know that Drake Industries has been looking to divest some of their manufacturing assets. The board has decided that running factories doesn't align with their core logistics business. Meridian Manufacturing is going up for sale. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't heard that. The announcement won't be public for another week, but I wanted to give you advance notice. I'm putting together an investment group to buy back my old company, Marcus, and I want you to be part of it. The idea was audacious. Harold Meridian, now 78 years old, wanted to repurchase the company he'd sold 8 years earlier. And he wanted me, the engineer who'd been fired and had built a competing business, to help him do it. What role would I play? I asked. Chief Technology Officer and partner. You'd own 20% of the company and have complete authority over all technical operations. Your job would be to restore Meridian to what it was when we knew every machine personally and took pride in building the best precision components in the industry. I was quiet for a long moment, processing the offer. Going back to Meridian would mean leaving the consulting business I'd built, giving up the freedom of running my own company, and returning to the facility where I'd experienced the worst professional humiliation of my life. But it would also mean the chance to restore something that had been broken, to rebuild a manufacturing culture based on craftsmanship instead of cost-cutting, and to create a legacy that would outlast my career. I'll need to think about it, Mr. Meridian. Of course you will. You're too smart to make a decision like this quickly. But Marcus, I want you to know something. What happened to you at Meridian was the biggest mistake in the company's 90-year history. Not just because of the technical problems that followed, but because we lost a man who embodied everything the company was supposed to represent. Thank you, sir. That means more than you know. Take your time thinking it over. But remember, sometimes the best way to move forward is to go back and fix what was broken. That evening, I drove to Meridian Manufacturing and sat in my car in the parking lot, looking at the building where I'd spent most of my adult life. The facility looked the same from the outside, but I knew that everything inside had changed. The systems I'd built had been restored, upgraded, and integrated into Meridian OS. The production lines were running more efficiently than they ever had. The company was profitable again, manufacturing some of the most precise components in the industry. But it wasn't the same company I'd left. The culture had changed, shaped by crisis and recovery, rather than the steady accumulation of knowledge and tradition that had defined Harold's era. The new employees didn't know the stories of how individual machines had been acquired, modified, and perfected over decades. They saw equipment instead of partners, systems instead of relationships. I thought about Rebecca's visit, about her description of another facility facing the same challenges that had nearly destroyed Meridian. How many other companies were making the same mistakes, prioritizing short-term savings over long-term wisdom. How many other engineers like me were being pushed aside in favor of consultants who promised modernization but delivered chaos. Chun Engineering Solutions have been successful, but our work was reactive, fixing problems that had already occurred, restoring systems that had already been broken. Harold's offer presented the opportunity to be proactive, to build something from the beginning that would demonstrate how manufacturing could embrace both innovation and tradition. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed my son Danny's number. "Hey, Dad, how's the empire building going?" I smiled. At 16, Danny had developed a teenager's bemused attitude toward his father's sudden transformation from downsized employee to successful entrepreneur. But I could hear pride in his voice when he talked about Chun Engineering Solutions to his friends. "It's going well. How's school?" "Boring, mostly. But I've been thinking about what you said about engineering programs. Maybe I should look at some schools with good manufacturing technology departments." My heart swelled with unexpected emotion. Danny had shown little interest in following his father's career path, preferring video games and basketball to machinery and mathematics. But our conversations over the past year had sparked something in him, an appreciation for the craft of making things that worked perfectly and lasted forever. "That would make me very proud, son." "Yeah, well, someone has to carry on the family business, right? Besides, after seeing what you've accomplished, I'm starting to think engineering might actually be cool." After we hung up, I sat in the dark parking lot thinking about legacy and purpose and the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. A year ago, I'd been a discarded employee with 20 years of knowledge that no one valued. Now I had a choice between continuing to build my own success or returning to help rebuild something that had been broken by other people's mistakes. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. 6 months later, I stood in the executive office of Meridian Manufacturing, not as a visitor or consultant, but as chief technology officer and part owner of the company, where my career had both ended and begun. The nameplate on my door read Marcus Chun, CTO, and the title felt both familiar and completely new. Harold Meridian had assembled an impressive investment group. Former employees who'd built successful careers after leaving the company, local investors who understood manufacturing, and industry veterans who recognized the value of institutional knowledge. Together, we'd purchased Meridian Manufacturing for $12 million, a fraction of what Drake Industries had paid for it, but a fair price for a company that was still recovering from the crisis of 2 years earlier. My first act as CTO had been to offer positions to key employees from Chun Engineering Solutions. Tommy Rodriguez became our director of operations, bringing his expertise in Meridian OS implementation. Sarah Kim, our lead software engineer, took charge of systems development. Janet Okafor, our former project manager, became director of quality assurance. We weren't just acquiring a company. We were building a demonstration project for the future of American manufacturing. The changes were subtle but important. Instead of optimizing for quarterly efficiency metrics, we optimized for long-term reliability and quality. Instead of treating employees as interchangeable resources, we invested in training and knowledge development. Instead of viewing older equipment as obsolete, we enhanced it with modern monitoring and control systems that preserved its precision while improving its capability. Most importantly, we documented everything. Every process, every modification, every lesson learned was recorded in comprehensive manuals that could be studied, taught, and improved upon by future generations of engineers. We were building systems that would outlast the people who created them, but we were also ensuring that the knowledge behind those systems would survive as well. 1 year after the acquisition, Meridian Manufacturing received its most prestigious recognition yet, the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award, the highest honor that could be bestowed on an American company for performance, excellence, and quality achievement. The ceremony took place in Washington, D.C., in a ballroom filled with industry leaders, government officials, and executives from companies across the country. As I stood at the podium accepting the award on behalf of Meridian Manufacturing, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. This award belongs to every person who understands that manufacturing excellence isn't just about efficiency or cost control, I said, looking out at the audience. It's about the patient accumulation of knowledge, the careful cultivation of craftsmanship, and the recognition that some things are worth preserving even when they're not easy to quantify on a spreadsheet. In the audience, I spotted several familiar faces. David Castellanos from Drake Industries, who'd flown in specifically for the ceremony. Tommy Rodriguez and Sarah Kim, beaming with pride at what we'd accomplished together. And in the back row, barely visible but unmistakably present, Rebecca Morrison. Our eyes met across the crowded room, and she nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement that carried more weight than any words could have conveyed. She'd been right about one thing during our confrontation 2 years earlier. I'd made them pay for what they'd done to me. But the payment hadn't come in the form of revenge or retribution. It had come in the form of proof that knowledge matters, that experience has value, and that the people who build things are worth more than the cost of their salaries. 5 years after my termination from Meridian Manufacturing, I stood once again on the observation deck above the factory floor, but this time the view was different. The equipment hummed with purposeful efficiency, operated by technicians who understood not just what to do, but why they were doing it. Quality metrics were displayed on screens throughout the facility, showing defect rates that were the envy of the industry and customer satisfaction scores that had never been higher. But the real measure of our success wasn't visible in statistics or awards. It was in the apprenticeship program we'd established with local technical colleges, where experienced engineers passed their knowledge to students who would carry it forward into the next generation. It was in the consulting work we continued to do for other manufacturers, helping them avoid the mistakes that had nearly destroyed Meridian. It was in the company culture we'd built, where institutional knowledge was treasured instead of discarded, where experience was valued alongside innovation. My son Danny had enrolled in mechanical engineering at Michigan Tech, choosing to spend his summer breaks working on the factory floor to learn the practical side of manufacturing. Watching him operate the same machines I'd programmed decades earlier, seeing him absorb the lessons that I'd learned through years of trial and error, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from creating something that will outlast your own career. Tommy Rodriguez had been promoted to general manager, overseeing daily operations with the same combination of technical skill and practical wisdom that had made him invaluable as a floor supervisor. Sarah Kim had developed the next generation of Meridian OS, incorporating artificial intelligence and machine learning in ways that enhanced human knowledge rather than replacing it. Janet Okafor had established quality protocols that were being adopted by manufacturers across the industry. We'd proven that the future of manufacturing didn't require abandoning the past. It required building bridges between old wisdom and new technology, between the craftsmen who understood machines by touch and sound, and the engineers who could optimize their performance with data and algorithms. On my desk sat 2 mementos of the journey that had brought me to this point. The first was the coffee mug my son had made in art class, the same mug I'd packed into a cardboard box on the day I was terminated, now holding pencils and serving as a reminder of what really matters in life. The second was a letter that had arrived the previous week, written on the letterhead of a manufacturing company in Ohio. The signature at the bottom belonged to Rebecca Morrison, who'd taken a position as director of operations after successfully preventing her new employer from making the same mistakes that had nearly destroyed Meridian. Dear Marcus, the letter began, I wanted you to know that we've implemented knowledge preservation protocols based on the model you developed at Meridian Manufacturing. Our senior engineer will be retiring next year, but thanks to the documentation and training systems we've put in place, his 30 years of experience won't walk out the door with him. I thought you'd appreciate knowing that the lessons you taught, sometimes harshly, are being applied to prevent other companies from experiencing what we went through. Thank you for showing us that knowledge is the most valuable asset any company can possess. I folded the letter and placed it back in my desk drawer, next to a dozen others like it from companies across the country that had learned to value institutional knowledge instead of discarding it in pursuit of short-term savings. The late afternoon sun slanted through my office windows, casting long shadows across the factory floor below. In a few hours, the day shift would end, and the evening crew would take over operations that would continue through the night with the precision and reliability that had become our company's signature. Somewhere in Detroit, in boardrooms and conference halls, executives were probably making decisions about other market trends. Experienced employees whose knowledge seemed expensive, whose systems appeared outdated, whose value couldn't be easily quantified on quarterly reports. Some of those decisions would prove wise, embracing change while preserving wisdom. Others would repeat the mistakes that had nearly destroyed Meridian manufacturing, prioritizing cost over quality and efficiency over understanding. But now there was a different model to follow, a demonstration that knowledge and innovation could coexist, that the future could be built on the foundation of the past rather than its ruins. Companies across the country were calling us for consultation, asking how to modernize without destroying, how to innovate while preserving the wisdom that made innovation possible. I closed my laptop and prepared to leave for the day, knowing that the systems would continue running smoothly in my absence. Not because I was irreplaceable, but because I'd finally learned how to make myself replaceable in the right way. The knowledge that had once existed only in my head now lived in documentation, training programs, and the minds of engineers who understood both the technology and the principles that made it work. Walking through the factory floor one last time before heading home, I passed the machines that had been my companions for more than 2 decades. They hummed their familiar songs of precision and purpose, tended by operators who knew their personalities and quirks, monitored by systems that could predict their needs and prevent their failures. I'd started my career as a young engineer who could make old machines work like new ones. I was ending it as something more valuable, a keeper of knowledge, a bridge between past and future, and proof that the most powerful form of revenge isn't destruction, it's creation. The knowledge that Rebecca Morrison had tried to discard had become the foundation of something greater than either of us had imagined. And in learning to value what others had overlooked, we discovered that the most important innovations aren't always the ones that replace what came before, but the ones that help it evolve. As I walked toward the exit, my footsteps echoing in the familiar space where I'd spent most of my adult life, I smiled at the irony of it all. I've been fired for being too expensive, too specialized, too dependent on obsolete systems. I'd built a career proving that knowledge is the most valuable resource any company can possess, and the most dangerous thing they can afford to lose. The machines hummed on, carrying forward the wisdom of decades and the promise of decades more to come. And somewhere in that harmony of old metal and new purpose, I heard the sound of something that neither spreadsheets nor consulting firms could ever truly quantify. The voice of craftsmanship, speaking across generations about what it means to build things that matter and to build them to last.